Time markers give us a chance to look at clauses. Clauses show up with many different sentence structures in the English language. Most people are familiar with because. Similarly, time clauses need a comma when the dependent clause is first. They don't need a comma when the main clause is first. So it's important to first understand what is a dependent clause and what is a main clause or an independent clause. Basically, the time clause here starts with the time word, generally when, although there are others of course. And if the time clause starts the sentence, then you need a comma between this time clause, which is dependent, and the main clause, which is independent. You know the main clause is independent because it has a subject, a verb, and an object, or at least a subject and a verb together. And it doesn't have anything else that makes it dependent on another clause. The time clause is dependent because it has this word here, which means it can't stand alone as its own sentence. So let's take a look at some structures here. Remember, with time clauses and markers, we're going to keep our verb tenses consistent. In this first example, I have time clauses using the past tense, and so I'm going to use the simple past in the independent clause, or the main clause. And so first I start out by having the time clause at the beginning of the sentence, which means that I need a comma separating the two clauses. Again, if the time clause comes at the end of a sentence, like this second example, then I don't need a comma to separate the two clauses. So when I was in school, we're talking about the past. When I was in school, we know that it's the past tense because was is the past. So the second verb, I played football a lot, is also going to be in the past tense. If we take off when, then that first clause, then we have a complete sentence. I was in school. So this idea that we have a dependent and an independent clause is created by one word here, when, or some sort of time indicator. Next example, when the hero went off to war. Again, if we took off when, we could make a complete sentence, the hero went off to war. We have past tense verb here, so we're going to make a past tense in the next clause, which is again the main clause or independent clause. His people stayed home and prayed for him. Here we have two verbs, both of them are simple past. As soon as I discover this information, we have a different sort of time indicator here, as soon as, and then we have I discovered this information. Again, take off that time word or small phrase and we get a complete sentence here. But because we have that time word or indicator, then it is a dependent clause. We need the comma before the main clause, I told the police. By the time I started studying, it was already 10 p.m. It means it was 10 p.m. at the time I started studying, or 10 p.m. had already passed when I started studying. Last one, just as I arrived, the call to prayer sounded. Again, past tense, past tense. So make yourself familiar with some of these time words here, not only when, but there are other ways to indicate time, and we'll look at a couple more down here. The other way to write a two-clause sentence is to make the main clause or the independent clause first, and then follow it by the dependent clause, which is the time clause in this example. So we need a subject and a verb at least, usually an object. They were already asleep. There's our first clause. We know that it's the end of the first clause for a couple of reasons. They were already asleep is a complete sentence. If we put a full stop there, that would be fine. The other way we know that it's a full clause, or the end of that clause, is because by the time is where we have the start of the next clause, which is the time clause. By the time is a time indicator. By the time I arrived. I arrived by itself could in fact be a full sentence. So these words here make it dependent on this first clause. My father called as I walked in the door. Right? My father called is our first clause, our main clause, or independent clause, excuse me, and then I walked in the door with as right there is our dependent clause. And remember, the second clause starts, or the time clause starts with those time indicator words. We will graduate from university as soon as we complete all of our requirements. We will graduate from university is our first main clause. It is independent, And then we have as soon as, which tells us it's the beginning of a time clause. We complete all of our requirements. We have to take English classes until we demonstrate sufficient skills to move forward in our studies. Kind of a long sentence, but if we just look at it, we have our subject, our verb, have to take. English classes, there's our object, so we got subject, verb, object, and just like that we end our main clause, and until starts the time clause, and we have subject, verb, and object clause. He always eats breakfast. Yeah, he always eats, that's our subject, verb, and object. And then just like that we have a time marker, or a time word, that starts the time clause, which is dependent, cannot stand alone. So again, if the time clause goes at the second half of the sentence, we don't need a comma. If it goes at the first half of the sentence, we need a comma. We're also going to look at time markers. Time markers are things like 2 days ago, last night, in some year, on some day or date. Right? So 3 years ago, we don't say before 3 years. I know a lot of students are tempted to say before 2 years, before 10 years, but in fact that is very incorrect. We say 3 years ago, and we have that time marker need a comma, and then we go straight into the rest of the sentence. So this is just setting up when we're talking about, what time is relevant to this. 3 years ago is in the past. We're going to use the simple past here. I lived in a different city. Last night means the night previous, the night before, whenever this person is talking. Last night is in the past, so we had dinner, past tense, together at my cousin's house. Need that comma right there after the sentence, or excuse me, after the time marker. In 2015, again, past tense, comma, because it's a time marker, I started learning how to program computers. This could stand alone by itself, but we want to tell people when this happened. Okay, you could also put the time marker at the end of the sentence. I went to bed early last night. And exactly like we saw with the time clause, if you put the time marker at the end of the sentence, you don't need a comma separating the rest of the sentence from the time marker. My sister was sick for a few days last week. Subject, verb, object clause, and then time marker. We stayed at my grandmother's house in May of 2014. Again, time marker starts with in May of 2014. I met with the boss yesterday at 11. Here we have a specific time. Yesterday, there's our time marker. So let's take a quick look at the simple past. Again, making questions with the simple past, since we are dealing with past tense involving time markers. So we can make simple past statements, obviously, by saying something like, I saw the movie yesterday, he went to the market at 3 o'clock yesterday. We're going to use did with questions. Right? We don't need to use did with affirmative statements in the past. We don't need to say, I did go to the market, because it's just easier to say, I went to the market. Right? But when making questions, we are going to use this did here. And that is the only past tense verb you'll see in the sentence. We're going to use the base verb for the active verb. Did is what's going to tell us it's in the past. So who did you see at the stadium? Right? It might take a moment to just get used to making the past tense with did rather than saw. We don't say who did you saw. We don't say who did you spoke to. Only one past tense. So who did you see? Base verb here. It's very important to remember. And this is obviously an information question. How did you feel after your team lost the big game? Again, past tense is established with did, and then feel is a base form. How did you feel after your team lost? Now I know you guys might see lost here and say, well, that's past tense, but that is a different grammar function. It's not the verb relating to the subject. Okay. Did you go out for coffee with your friends yesterday afternoon? Right? So did you go, here's our base verb, out for coffee with your friends yesterday afternoon. This is a yes or no. So when you're starting the sentence or the question with did, you're going to get a yes or no answer. Maybe a little additional information, but yes I did, or no I didn't is sufficient for an answer. Did you see the news? Yes I did. No I didn't. Those are sufficient. Did is the past tense and then base verb following that. We can also make questions with was or were in the subject, and then there are a few different options after the subject. We could put an adjective, we could put at some place, we could put a gerund clause. I'm sure there are other things we could do with it. Here are some examples. Were you visiting your grandparents last week? Obviously, be verb questions are yes or no. So were you, this is a gerund. Were you visiting your parents last week? Or I suppose we could say this is past continuous. Excuse me. Were you visiting your grandparents last week? That's a yes or no question. Was he excited to see you? Again, yes or no question. Was Bob at the party? Yes or no question. Were they playing video games? Yes or no question. And I suppose we could just say continuous there. All right. And so, again, time markers, time clauses, these things are an introduction to independent and dependent clauses, of which we'll see more in later videos. So if you have the dependent clause first, you'll need that comma. If you have the dependent clause in the second half of the sentence, you don't need the comma. You know the dependent clause is starting because you have those time words, right? And whether or not they're in the beginning or middle of the sentence doesn't matter. The time clause starts at the beginning with that time word. Okay, so don't forget your commas if they come at the beginning of the sentence.